Friedrich Nietzsche looked at the historical doctrine of hell and saw not a theological revelation, but the single most efficient weapon of psychological compliance ever engineered. If you want to control a population, earthly law enforcement is a logistical nightmare. Think about the height of the Roman Empire. To maintain civil order, the state needed massive standing legions, garrisons in every province, corruptible tax collectors, physical chains, and actual wooden crosses. It was a brutally expensive enterprise. More importantly, it was entirely dependent on physical proximity. A Roman centurion had to actually see you break the law to punish you. The moment the guard walked around the corner, or the sun went down, you were free to rebel in the shadows. Earthly tyranny is always limited by the state's budget for surveillance. But what happens when you introduce a doctrine where the ultimate punishment doesn't require a physical guard? Where the surveillance camera is installed directly into a man's own conscience? You get the most perfect system of human domestication ever devised. You get a population that polices itself in the dark. To understand Nietzsche's argument in works like The Antichrist and On the Genealogy of Morality, you have to strip away the spiritual sentiment and look at the raw mechanics of power. Every earthly tyrant in human history faced one insurmountable limitation: the biological fragility of the human body. A dictator can torture you, imprison you, or starve you, but eventually your body breaks. The moment you die, you escape his jurisdiction. Death was the ultimate sanctuary for the oppressed. The doctrine of eternal damnation closed that loophole. It explicitly removed death as an escape hatch by inventing an indestructible part of you, the soul, so that the torture could be made infinite. Suddenly, the tyrant's jurisdiction didn't end at the grave. It extended into eternity. Let's look at a concrete example of how this unverifiable fear operates on a person's mind, particularly if you grew up in a strict, high-compliance household. Consider the concept of the thought crime. You don't have to steal a loaf of bread or punch your neighbor to feel the terrifying weight of the system. You just have to feel a flash of unauthorized anger or experience a natural, unapproved physical desire. You haven't done a single thing in the physical world, but your heart rate spikes. The guilt washes over you instantly. Why? Because the threat is permanently active, and there is absolutely no way to verify if you've triggered the trap. You can't check a dashboard to see if a divine ledger logged your angry thought. Because you can never objectively verify that you are safe, you are forced to assume you are always in danger. Psychologists call the extreme version of this scrupulosity, an obsessive, paralyzing fear that you have accidentally committed an unpardonable sin. Personally, I find this architectural brilliance terrifying in its cold efficiency. When you study the great engineering marvels of history, the pyramids, the Roman aqueducts, the Saturn V rocket, they pale in comparison to the psychological engineering required to convince millions of human beings to willingly construct their own torture chamber, lock themselves inside it, and carry it around in their heads for an entire lifetime. This brings us to the core of Nietzsche's critique, the concept of infinite debt, or what he called Schuld. In the physical, secular world, a debt has strict mathematical boundaries. If you owe a bank $1 million and you lose your business, you declare bankruptcy, or you go to debtor's prison. Or, eventually, your life ends and the ledger is closed. The math stops. But historical institutional religion engineered a moral debt that you are allegedly born with, original sin, and that you can never pay off through your own merit. You are infinitely in the red the exact moment you draw your first breath. And because the penalty for defaulting on this infinite debt is infinite punishment, your daily compliance must also be infinite. You can never sit back in your chair and say, "I've done enough. I'm square with the house." The system demands a constant, lifelong state of anxiety about your standing. But if you think this mechanism died out just because church attendance dropped in the 21st century, you are entirely misreading the modern world. The architecture of hell didn't disappear. It just underwent a secular rebrand. Look closely at our modern corporate, political, and social systems. We have built a brand new, secular panopticon that relies on the exact same structure of permanent, unverifiable threat to keep you compliant and quiet. Consider the digital public square and the modern phenomenon of social annihilation. What gets loosely labeled as cancel culture. It operates on the identical psychological machinery that medieval inquisitors used. There is no statute of limitations on your digital sins. A joke you made 20 years ago, or an opinion that was mainstream a decade ago, can resurrect at any moment to destroy your livelihood, your reputation, and your family's financial security. The threat is eternal because the internet is forever. It is also entirely unverifiable. You never know who is screenshotting your private conversation, who is mining your past, or what new standard of ideological purity will be retroactively applied to your life tomorrow morning. And because you cannot verify your safety, you do exactly what the terrified medieval peasant did. You censor yourself. You swallow your true opinions. You keep your mouth shut in the corporate boardroom. You nod along with blatant absurdities because the threat of total social and financial ruin hangs over your head. It is a secular hell, and it enforces mass compliance without the state ever having to fire a single physical bullet or hire a single police officer. Now, here's what I think about these modern ideological enforcers. They are actually vastly inferior to the historical religious institutions they replaced. Say what you will about the medieval church, but they at least offered a clear, structured path to absolution. You knew exactly how many prayers to recite or what penance to perform to clear the ledger and sleep soundly. Today's secular Puritans demand the infinite guilt without ever offering the possibility of redemption. Under the modern system, you are just permanently on probation. So you have to ask yourself the most important question in philosophy. Who benefits from keeping you in this state of permanent, unresolvable suspense? This is where we must examine the economics of the afterlife, or the economics of any system of permanent threat. You always have to look for the middleman. In Nietzsche's historical analysis, the invention of hell necessitated the invention of the priest. If you are infected with an invisible disease that will kill you forever, you desperately need the man who holds the invisible cure. The threat of hell transferred unimaginable wealth, massive tracts of land, and supreme political power to the institutional church over centuries. Think of the medieval practice of selling indulgences, literally monetizing invisible fear by convincing men to buy pieces of paper to shorten their time in a purgatory they couldn't see. The middleman manufactures the sickness in order to sell you the remedy, and you must pay them in tithes, in daily obedience, in total intellectual submission. For a cure they can't prove works, to save you from a disease they can't prove exists. Today, the middlemen just wear different uniforms. They are the corporate HR departments, the diversity consultants, the political commissars, and the mainstream media pundits. They hold the keys to your social and economic survival. They define what the unpardonable sins are this week, and they collect a massive cultural and literal tax for guiding you safely away from the secular fires of ruin. They are entirely dependent on your fear to justify their authority and their salaries. It is vital to understand how this specific type of fear alters human biology and psychology over a lifetime. Real, physical fear is acute and finite. If you are chased by a predator in the woods, your adrenaline spikes, you run, and it either ends in your escape or your death. The biological loop closes. Your nervous system resets. But the threat of hell, whether theological or social, is an open loop. It is perpetual suspense. And human neurology is not designed to process perpetual suspense. It degrades you on a cellular level. It wears down your vital energy, your masculine courage, and your capacity for independent thought. You become weary. And a weary, anxious man is incredibly easy to govern. Let me tell you my take on this from a purely philosophical perspective. The profound tragedy of this mechanism isn't just that it caused historical suffering. The real tragedy is that for thousands of years, billions of men traded away their agency in the one real, tangible life they were guaranteed to have, all out of paralyzing fear of a hypothetical torture in a realm they couldn't prove existed. They gave away their only certainty for a phantom. Which brings us to the ultimate application. How do you dismantle this architecture in your own mind? How do you stop being a prisoner to a threat you can't even see? You do it by forcing the system to show its hand. You demand earthly verification. You have to learn the litmus test for distinguishing between a legitimate consequence and a manipulative control threat. A legitimate consequence has firm boundaries, clear logic, and a definitive endpoint. If you touch a hot stove, you get burned. The lesson is learned. The pain heals. The transaction is completely over. If you break a just, physical law, you pay a fine or serve a sentence. The ledger is cleared and you walk out of the building. A control threat, on the other hand, relies entirely on ambiguity, shifting rules, and the concept of infinity. It is deliberately vague so that your own mind will step in and imagine a punishment far worse than anything they could actually inflict on you. The moment you realize that the power of hell, in all its historical and modern forms, exists strictly within the boundaries of your own imagination, the lock on the prison door snaps. They do not have the power to condemn you forever. They only have the power to convince you to condemn yourself today. When you finally refuse to be your own jailer, the most effective weapon ever invented becomes entirely useless. Tell me where I'm wrong. Comment section is open, and I read every one of them. Subscribe if this actually made you think. Philosophy every week. No fluff, no motivation posters.